Where are these drones being lifted from that they are managing to make this amount of damage around Moscow and that part of Russia? The reason I ask this, Brennan, is because they are a long way from Ukraine.
Well, that's an interesting question. And I'm sure the Russians are trying to figure out exactly where they originated from. That airfield, the primary airfield that was hit today, is up near Estonia
Yeah.
and Latvia, but I can't, or I'm sorry, Lithuania, but I cannot imagine that they would allow any type of operations from their soil. So it begs the question, is this some pro-Ukrainian Russians,
Working from
or
inside
is
Russia.
working from inside Russia, or is this, and I mean, there's a number of alternatives we could look at, or is this something as simple as some Ukrainians that have crossed the border? It's a rather porous border, and we've seen examples of it before that have taken these drones and the explosive that were included with the drones and just got to somewhere in Russia that they felt safe enough to go ahead and launch the drones.
I mean,
Because all you have to do is launch them and then take off,
yeah.
skedaddle.
Yeah. The power and range of these drones we've seen recently has been remarkable, hasn't it, Brendan? Just how far they can get, both across land and sea.
Oh yeah, it's incredible, and you can control them from literally around the world. A lot of what was going on in Afghanistan and Iraq at the height of those wars,
Mm.
the U.S. operators were sitting at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, right outside of Las Vegas, and the aircraft themselves, the drones themselves, of course, were being launched from all sorts of places in the Middle East, but they were controlled from Las Vegas. So it's a remarkable technology that is, it's being used against Ukraine, but it's obviously the Ukrainians are using it against Russia too.
Yeah, I mean, recent gains by Ukrainian troops on the southern front could open the way for pushing the Russians back to the annexed Crimean Peninsula. This is according to the Foreign Minister, Dmytro Kuleba, has said today. Do you think claims like that mean the Foreign Minister is potentially getting ahead of himself, or is that realistic?
Well, I think the Ukrainians have played an absolutely brilliant psychological warfare game against the Russians. So I can't imagine that things are being said that aren't vetted at the highest levels of the Ukrainian government within their Ministry of Defense. And oftentimes it's the silence that accompanies some of these activities that
Yeah.
is really, really interesting. So it's, I don't know, they may be getting ahead of ground operations, but I just can't imagine that they would be so foolish as to telegraph and really give the Russians a heads up as to where they're going. But I mean, it's no secret the Ukrainians need to get to the Sea of Azov and split off that land bridge between Crimea and southwestern Russia.
Yeah, that's the key, isn't it? By getting to the Sea of Azov and splitting Russian forces, it would mean some Russian forces were left in a pocket. But of course, they still would have sea access to support their troops there. But the Ukrainians are thinking that is key, creating that divide and going from there.
Oh, I think it is too. I think what it does, the division of forces, is one of the principles of warfare that it allows you, as the attacker, to go ahead and practice what we call economy of force.
Right.
You can start using forces against Crimea and hold the Russians in place there at the southwestern portion of Russia. Uh, you create dilemmas for the Russians. They have their logistics problems are magnified, and yes, you're absolutely right. They could resupply Crimea by sea, but the Ukrainians have proved adept
Mm.
at sinking Russian ships. So they may be more than happy to engage Russian ships at sea.
I suppose you've also got to think, though, that the number of minefields, fortifications that have been put down in the last year and a half is unprecedented. They've got the Russian drones that we've already talked about. They've got helicopters, Russian planes. They dominate the air, not the Ukrainian military. But yet through, despite saying all that, the Ukrainian military say that they are succeeding. But when you hear about the might of the Russian military, how do they take that on and create that land wedge that they're aiming to do? How is it possible with what they've currently got?
Well, it's actually, if you look at the history of this conflict, the Ukrainians have consistently outfought and outthought the Russian military. The Russian military is a mere shadow of its former self. Logistically, they just can't seem to do anything right. They're It's very localized air superiority that they have. Neither country can really claim it. So it's one of those things where the Ukrainians, that and their soldiers, they're better led, better
Mm.
trained, and they prove it on the battlefield every single day. So my bet continues to be with the Ukrainians.
Let's talk about the casualty figures, because there are some figures that have come out from US officials recently in the last day or so, putting the number around 70,000 Ukrainians to have died so far in the conflict since the 22nd of February of 2022, and as many as 120,000 injured. I mean, that is just quite frankly a staggering figure. From an armed forces in Ukraine, only estimated at around about 500,000. The UN has recorded around about 10,000 civilian deaths, and if you look at the Russian side, it's far greater. It's thought there could be 120,000 dead, according to a US estimate. But its army, its population, of course, much bigger than that. It's very unclear, though. They're estimates from the UN, those figures, and the US. But it's when you read them out loud and you hear those numbers, it's absolutely earth-shatteringly staggering that amount of people have died in this conflict.
It is the numbers are large. When you look at the history of warfare and other conflicts that would be characterized as high intensity combat, these numbers are not unusual. I think the Ukrainians, because of interior lines and fighting in their own country, have a much, much better record of returning casualties to the battlefield.
Mm.
And these are men and women that willingly want to go back and fight for their country. The Russians have had a horrendous reputation of basically losing their wounded. If you get wounded and you're a serving Russian soldier in Ukraine, the odds are you're not going to survive. Where if you're wounded as a Ukrainian, the odds are that you will survive.
Why is that, Brendan?
So
Why is that?
I think it's primarily because the Ukrainians place a great deal of emphasis on having a very, very efficient, very, very effective military medical corps.
Mm.
And they just, the Russians, you hate to say it, but they just don't seem to care. And they're willing to take the casualties and just not spend a whole lot of effort trying to rehabilitate them. And that's part of the Russian military history. It was the same story in Afghanistan, and certainly the
Yeah.
same story during World War II, where they were taking 8,000 casualties a week. So it's
I've
not
heard.
unusual.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard Ukrainian soldiers say in multiple reports that that Russia's ability to absorb pain appears limitless.
Well, I think a whole lot of that is psychological. These men and women that are fighting for Ukraine, for the large part, are volunteers, and they are doing it against an enemy that they hate. And every time the Russians go ahead and fire artillery or rockets or drones and kill Ukrainian civilians, all it does is steal the resolve of both the Ukrainian people
Mm.
and the Ukrainian military. So, Rick, it's not a surprise. I think the Ukrainian soldier has proven once again that a well-led soldier can do miraculous things, and that's exactly what they are. They're well-led, well-trained, well-equipped, and the Russians are just the opposite of that.